I'm sure listeners are going to disagree with this rendering, but I will tell, I've spent a lot of time studying this. Here's what we know for a fact. There's a downtown 2 express train in New York City. There were 4 guys who were acting up on it. Bernhard Goetz got on 14th Street, and within about moments, one of the guys approached him and either asked for money, hey sir, can I have $5? Or demanded money, give me $5. Goetz felt at that moment that he was about to be mugged, pulled out his handgun. He had an unlicensed Smith & Wesson revolver, shot all of them in succession, 1, 2, 3, 4. The other thing that's not in dispute, he then rents a car, drives up to New Hampshire, hides out for a few days, ultimately turns himself in. A lot of people felt in New York that this guy finally did what needed to be done because the police can't keep us safe, and then therefore this citizen has sort of done what I wish in my heart that I could do, but just couldn't.
We're joined at the Daily Signal today by Elliot Williams. You might recognize him for all of our Daily Signal fans who wake up early on Friday mornings to watch me on CNN This Morning. Elliot is usually sitting around the table with me. He does the Lawyer Up segment and oftentimes is the go-to person for Audie Cornish whenever she has a legal question. And that's much to my delight because I'm no lawyer. And so it's great to have Elliot there on the panel. Elliot, welcome.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Well, Elliot is the author of a new book. It's called 5 Bullets. It's about the story of Bernie Goetz, and it's a story that I was not familiar with until I heard Elliot talk about this, not only in the preview and run-up to the book's publication, but also with Audie on the show. Elliot, you have served as a lawyer for the Department of Justice, for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, but this is a story not about Washington, D.C. It goes to the heart of New York City. Tell us why you decided to write a book on this topic.
I think part of why I wanted to write a book on this topic is because it's not Washington, D.C. and the world we live in. So I grew up just outside New York City. I was born in Brooklyn. My dad worked 2 jobs in New York City for most of my childhood. And this was a formative sort of public events and law story from my childhood. A lot of people will remember Bernhard Goetz shoots these 4 black teenagers in the New York City subway, ultimately ran, turned himself in, and then came back and was heralded as a bit of a hero, right? Because of how unsafe New York City was. Folks might remember it had a homicide rate of about 2,000 at the time. There was graffiti everywhere. It was messy. And a lot of people saw Bernhard Goetz as this hero of sorts. Many people saw that sort of praising the vigilante behavior. And so after years as a lawyer and thinking about the story, I just thought, maybe this would be good to revisit in 2026 and just see how ripe the subject matter still is for us today.
Sure. And as you write about in the book, I mean, it really has an intersection and has dramatic impact in terms of the political figures in New York City who would emerge in the years following the Bernhard Goetz story. Take us back to that period of time because you touched on something there. The New York City of the 1980s was quite different from the New York of today and what we think of in terms of Times Square and certainly some of the other attractions that draw so many millions of people to visit New York. What was New York like back then? What was it like growing up?
Yeah. And again, no matter how much people would like to think that New York City or even cities in America are rough today, and again, we're living with a lot of this right now. Look, pretty much the main headlines in a newspaper today are about sort of fights between law enforcement and people in cities happening right now. But just take a step back and think about just the homicide rate, 2,000 people a year roughly. At that point. Now, in a city like New York, the homicide rate is I think, a quarter of that, around 300 people a year. Aggregate that over every statistic: assaults, violent crimes, graffiti, litter, and it was just a different place. The city, New York City in the 1980s was broke and mismanaged. It was seeking bailouts from the federal government. You might remember an iconic daily news headline, Ford to City, drop dead, where the city had sought a bailout from Gerald Ford, who was president at the time. And people just generally felt scared. Think about pop culture from the time. The biggest movies, some of them of the era, Escape from New York, The Warriors, Death Wish, were all about this dystopian hellscape, just a really, really rough time in the city. And so as a result, when there was this act, this somewhat vigilante act, a lot of people felt in New York, this guy finally did what needed to be done because the police can't keep us safe. And then therefore this citizen has sort of done what I wish in my heart that I could do, but just couldn't. So the incident just touched a lot of people and really sort of polarized the city.
Well, let's talk about the incident. And I should also acknowledge that you interviewed Bernhard Goetz as well. So I'd love to hear about that in a moment. But take us to the subway and how did he become known as this subway vigilante?
Yeah. So and again, even I'm sure listeners are going to disagree with this rendering, but I will tell you, I've spent a lot of time studying this. Here's what we know for a fact. There's a downtown 2 express train in New York City. There were 4 guys who were acting up on it. They were doing pull-ups and sort of banging on the seats, asking people for cigarettes and matches, and sort of acting up in the train car. Bernhard Goetz got on 14th Street, and within about moments, one of the guys approached him and either asked for money, hey, sir, can I have $5? Or demanded money, give me $5. One of those 2 things happened. And to this day, no one has said definitively which of the 2 it was. Needless to say, Goetz felt at that moment that he was about to be mugged, pulled out his handgun. He had an unlicensed Smith & Wesson revolver, shot all of them in succession, 1, 2, 3, 4, and is believed to have shot one of them twice and believed possibly to have said to that guy as he's on the ground, you don't look so bad, here's another, and shot him again. That guy ends up paralyzed from the mid-chest down and brain damaged. So that's all that's sort of the 4 corners of what's not in dispute. Everything else of, was it a mugging? Was it a threat? Did he yell? Did he not yell? Did they approach him as a group or whatever else? There's evidence on all sides to suggest that some of those things might have happened. But the other thing that's not in dispute, he then rents a car, drives up to New Hampshire, hides out for a few days, ultimately turns himself in, and then comes back to New York City. And again, as I said a second ago, sort of, to some people, was heralded as a hero.
As you put the pieces of the story together, were there no others on the train who attempted to stop him or intervene in this particular case?
No, people were terrified because the shots started going off and they just didn't know what was happening or what to expect. And so it was sort of pandemonium and chaos. I interviewed one of the passengers on the train. He thought it might have been a terrorist act or a hate crime or something. And he thought, oh no, this guy's going to come shoot me too. So he actually grabbed his baby. It was him with a baby and his wife, grabbed his baby and ran and tried to get off the train car. In fact, they fun detail in the story, they were rushing so quickly they left their stroller on the train and then just sort of tried to get away.
And after Goetz turns himself in, then what happens in terms of the trial and when it comes to holding him accountable for his action?
Well, he's ultimately acquitted of all violent crime charges, and the defense had taken a novel approach to getting him off, which is by playing his confession. They thought that the defense actually thought that the confession helped him because he confesses to the crime. Like, let's just be clear. He says, I wanted to murder these guys. I wanted to cause them as much pain as possible. I was so mad I could have gouged one of the kids' eyes out with my keys. Like, there's no question it's a confession. The defense actually thinks that it helps him because he was talking about how afraid he was. And the defense said, if we can play this for the jury and have them get a sense of the fear that he felt, we can actually probably get a couple of them to vote to acquit him. And it actually was a gamble that paid off. It was such a risky gamble, and this is a fun little detail I put in the book, 5 Bullets, that the defense, the 2 attorneys bet a car on it. And the lead defense attorney, Barry Slotnick, says, if this wins, this crazy plan you've hatched to play the confession tape and win, I'm going to buy you a truck. And he actually buys his law partner in a 1985 Isuzu Trooper, which is like literally the most 1980s car ever. But yeah, that's the story of how he ultimately gets acquitted. And I put all that in the book.
Now, as this is going on, of course, there is intense media coverage.
Yes.
And you also write about the role of an established newspaper known as the New York Post, one of the oldest in our country, owned by Rupert Murdoch. And so what was the media environment like covering this trial? And did you see in that coverage differences in terms of how the narrative was being shaped maybe by the Post and other publications.
Yeah, so absolutely. The Murdoch had just bought the Post in the late 1970s and really was focused on sensation and getting people scared and the clicks and the big headlines. And with that, he actually brought all the tabloids in New York with him, right? So it became an arms race to produce the most sensational headlines. And as we know from our world today, people, when they're scared, they turn to the news. They get more scared and turn to the news again. And it became a continuing cycle where they were reading these 3-inch headlines about how rough and how unsafe the city was, and ultimately just buying more newspapers. And the Post ended up being quite successful in this era, but also drove a certain type of coverage about crime and sort of whipping people up. Now, also something to remember is that in 1984, people didn't have CNN, MSNBC, Fox, the Daily Signal, or whatever else.
Social media.
Right? They really had just 3 newspapers, right? The Daily News, the New York Post, the New York Times, and nightly news, nightly local news. There just wasn't different places to consume information. And so if the main publications that folks are looking at on the subway every day, because remember, the tabloids, if you think about the Daily News and the New York Post, they're only about this big, right? So you can hold them on the subway and you could read them. If their only news sources are feeding them a narrative about how frightened they are, it actually got into the public consciousness. And there's a whole chapter in the book, 5 Bullets, about sort of the impact of the New York Post on how it drove people's coverage about crime and safety.
Well, and certainly that coverage in some ways benefited the political careers of certain individuals in New York City, right? And so you read about 2 of them, Al Sharpton and Rudy Giuliani, who are well-known figures today, but at the time were probably little known outside of their little neighborhoods in New York City. And so talk about each of those and how they use this moment to make a name for themselves. Yeah,
it's really interesting. So I thought it would just be a not cool, but just an impactful and interesting story to tell the Bernie Goetz story and sort of revisiting it. I didn't realize how many roads led through the Bernhard Goetz case. And we mentioned Sharpton and Giuliani, who are both barely in their 40s at this point. They're very young men, but on their path, they're ambitious and wanting to sort of build names for themselves. And they did. And they Sharpton as a street-level activist at this point. He's not a national figure. Giuliani is U.S. attorney, and I detail in the book a meeting that they had about the case, about Sharpton pushing Giuliani to bring charges. Another one was Curtis Sliwa, who just ran for mayor of New York the other day. He had founded this civilian patrol called the Guardian Angels, and he capitalized on all the safety issues in New York to sort of draw attention to the Guardian Angels and his work. And I guess, and the other big one that I had no idea of this was the National Rifle Association, which prior to 1977 really wasn't focused at all, or at least much, on Second Amendment advocacy. They really were focused on skeet shooting with grandpa, basically. They were they were all sports and not any of the political stuff. And it was actually a really big rift within the organization over moving into this direction. Well, a few years after that shift, the Goetz case happened, and he was as perfect a face, at least on paper, for the NRA's new mission as anybody else could have been. He was sort of a law-abiding white gun owner from a blue city in a blue state that had denied him a gun permit, that had a high crime rate, and he used his gun, what he claimed was self-defense. The narrative, at least in the abstract, worked perfectly for a Second Amendment rights organization. Now, the more they learned about him, they learned he's a sort of quirky guy, and we don't really want to fully embrace everything about this guy. But the contours of the story were actually quite good for the NRA. So all of this led to sort of a lot of roads leading through the case. And I will say this, something else that occurred to me through the writing: you don't realize how many national figures come from New York City, for better or worse. Right. Think of how many people run for president, maybe not successfully, but Bill de Blasio and Rudy Giuliani, Al Sharpton, Mike Bloomberg, and on, and I'm sure there are more, Donald Trump, but they all, something about the crucible of this major city And this major media market just created a lot of big national figures.
Elliot, picking up on that last point you were making about the NRA, New York today, I grew up in upstate New York, so 5 hours from the city, but I'm well aware that New York has taken a lead in terms of some of the restrictions in terms of Second Amendment rights and has a law named the SAFE Act. What were New York's gun laws at the time, and was Bernie Goetz in violation even to be carrying the gun on the subway?
So you could get a concealed carry permit in New York at the time, but very few people did. And one of the few places Donald Trump actually comes up in the book was I had interviewed a former policy head of the NRA who was sort of policy guy at the time, and it told me that really the only people who could get concealed or who did get concealed carry permits in New York at the time were folks like Donald Trump, big, high-profile, rich folks. Would get a concealed permit. Eleanor Roosevelt is another one who I did not know was a big handgun owner and was under New York's old permitting scheme. Over time, obviously that shifted, and with the Bruin Supreme Court case, however many years ago, that sort of undid a lot of the regulation in New York. Things have shifted a little bit in the state. It's still obviously a stricter gun state than Texas or Louisiana or whatever else. What I will say, and it's funny you mentioned being upstate, the NRA, and I detail this in the book 5 Bullets, the NRA does a press conference in New York to sort of raise concern with New York City's gun laws, because at the time, and this is to your original question, Rob, at the time, New York City's gun laws were more restrictive than gun laws elsewhere in the state. And there was a disconnect between, you could be in Dutchess County and be a lawful, like a lawful gun possessor in Dutchess County or Putnam County or whatever else. But when you came into the city, your gun rights would change. Well, the NRA used that as their basis for doing their press conference in New York. Without focusing on Bernie Goetz at all, they simply could say, wait a second, the city itself is creating a civil rights issue because of the fact that their rules are more restrictive than the rules even a couple miles upstate. So they used sort of not the state's laws, but the city's laws as their way in to talking about what they regarded as inequality and frankly on a civil rights level about gun laws in New York.
Quite interesting, yes. And I believe at the time, and maybe still to this day, the NRA was incorporated in New York State, which became an issue later on in terms of some of the actions that the state government took. Yeah,
I don't know the answer to that in terms of the incorporation question, which is an interesting one. What I do know is that going a few years before Bernie Goetz, one of the big issues that the folks who took the NRA over had with the former leadership was that the former leadership of the NRA wanted to move the headquarters to Colorado Springs, actually, because, again, they saw themselves as fundamentally a sporting organization. And they just wanted to, okay, we're done with Washington. We're done with all the big stuff. We're going to move out to the country. The sort of more activist Second Amendment advocacy folks said, no, we need a presence in Washington, D.C. That is where we need to be. And that was part of what caused that rift. And one of the chapters of the book details the takeover, literally a takeover. They call it the revolt at Cincinnati, like a coup in Cincinnati, which was where the NRA's annual convention was, saying that, look, even as exhibited in where they want to put the headquarters of this organization, they are just not focused on the rights of gun owners. And the cleavage in the organization was, I think, one of the more enlightening things that I came across in reporting the book, because I had no idea. I just assumed the NRA from its inception was really about the Second Amendment, and to some extent, that wasn't entirely the case.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, and I know that the NRA's publications, American Rifleman, I think American Hunter, so even the names of those reflect more of the historical nature of the NRA than maybe its current iteration, which is now based in Fairfax.
Fairfax, yeah, it's Virginia, because when you're driving out in 50 or 66. Yeah,
yes,
right.
That's right. So, Elliot, bring us up to speed today. You did have the opportunity to talk to Bernhard Goetz. I was surprised to hear that. What was that conversation like, and what is he like today, maybe as compared to this image that we saw in the 1980s?
It was a fascinating 45 minutes that I have lived. He's just all over the place, and I think back to the NRA, it's indicative of the fact that they provided him $20,000 on 2 different occasions for his legal defense, saying, "We don't endorse him, but we endorse the broader issues that he represents, which is the right of lawful gun owners to protect themselves." Full stop. Over time, even the NRA backed off of Bernie Goetz, saying this is not about him because this guy is weird and quite odd. So he just, the way the New York Times feature about this book, there was a front page piece on the book last Wednesday, the 21st. And they said that he rambles annoyingly on my call with him. And I think that's a good way to put it. He just rambled. He's just all over the place, just from idea to idea. He's a really bright guy, but just literally all over the place and unrepentant about the shooting. And that's what I found most fascinating. There wasn't a moment of his saying, look, I felt aggrieved. I felt scared in that moment and thought I was protecting my own life. It was, those guys needed to be shot. I don't care if that kid's paralyzed, in effect. I didn't use those words, but those guys needed to be shot. They had what was coming to them. I'm just the one that happened to do it. And he just is dug in and unrepentant about the shooting. I just found that even for someone who felt that he did the right thing, I was expecting at least a moment of reflection or self-awareness about, hey, anytime someone's paralyzed and brain damaged, it's kind of a tragedy, right? And there's just none of that from him.
Interesting. And how about the 4 individuals who he shot? Have you spoken to them, or can you give us an update on what they're doing?
I note in the preface of the book that I tried really hard to talk to them. I ended up, the closest I got was on the phone and over email and text with one of the injured guy's sisters. None of them wanted to appear for the book. Now, 2 are deceased. One died in prison. One died of an apparent suicide on the anniversary of the shooting, actually, years ago. One obviously is brain damaged and paralyzed, and one seems to have turned his life around somewhat. He, I believe, works as an auto mechanic. It's in somewhere upstate New York, and really does not like coming back to the city. Doesn't want to come back. And just wants to move on from that life. But, not that I thought it would have been a failure to proceed with the book without talking to them, but it's something that kept me up at night as a reporter or writer. I really wanted to just have their voices. And I tried to make the case that, look, I interviewed Bernhard Goetz, and he said all kinds of stuff about your brother. I would love to just hear your thoughts. Tell me what. But they opted out.
Okay. Well, Elliot Williams, the book is called 5 Bullets. Thank you for writing it. Thanks for spending time with the Daily Signal to tell us all about this story. Fascinating. And we look forward and encourage our readers to pick up a copy. We'll be sure to leave a link in the description in the show notes. Any final words from you?
No, thank you so much. I mean, it's, I've loved being on TV with you, if not every week. Quite regularly. And I was so grateful that you invited me on. So, keep having these interesting conversations over at the Daily Signal. That's great.
Thanks, Elliot. Have a great day. We appreciate it.
Take care.